In the frozen wilderness of Alaska, where temperatures drop to -40 degrees and visibility can vanish in seconds, most people pray they never have to fire a weapon in anger. But sometimes, when everything goes wrong and lives hang in the balance, a single shot can rewrite history. This is the true story of how a 22-year-old rookie police officer, armed with nothing but determination and a rifle she had barely qualified with, faced down armed criminals in conditions so brutal that even seasoned veterans would hesitate. What happened in those terrifying minutes would not only save innocent lives, but transform her from the department's newest member into a legend whispered about in police academies across the country. This is not a story about luck or coincidence. This is about courage, precision, and the moment when training meets destiny in the most unforgiving environment on Earth. Sarah Chun had always dreamed of being a police officer, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of patrolling the remote wilderness of northern Alaska. At 22 years old, she was the youngest officer ever hired by the Fairbanks North Star Borough Police Department, and after just 3 months on the job, she was already questioning whether she had made a terrible mistake. The morning of January 15th started like any other brutal winter day in Alaska. Sarah pulled on her thermal underwear, thick wool socks, and the multiple layers that would keep her alive in temperatures that could kill an unprepared person in minutes. Outside her small apartment, the thermometer read -38 degrees Fahrenheit, and the weather forecast promised it would only get colder as the day progressed. As she drove to the police station in her personal vehicle, Sarah reflected on how different her life had become since moving from sunny California to pursue her law enforcement dreams. Back home in San Diego, she had been a standout at the police academy, scoring in the top 5% of her class in both physical fitness and marksmanship. Her instructors had praised her steady hands and calm demeanor under pressure, qualities that seemed almost mythical now as she struggled to adapt to the harsh realities of Arctic policing. The Fairbanks Police Department was unlike anything she had experienced during her training. Instead of patrolling city streets and responding to typical urban crimes, officers here dealt with a unique set of challenges that required specialized skills and equipment. Wildlife encounters were common, with moose and bears posing real threats to both officers and civilians. The extreme weather created situations that would seem impossible to officers in warmer climates, from vehicles that wouldn't start at -50 degrees to crime scenes that had to be processed in conditions that made evidence collection nearly impossible. Sarah's training officer, Detective Mike Kowalski, was a 20-year veteran who had seen everything the Alaskan wilderness could throw at law enforcement. A former military sniper who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, Mike had taken Sarah under his wing despite his initial skepticism about her ability to handle the unique demands of Arctic policing. At 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing over 200 pounds, Mike was perfectly suited to the physical demands of the job, while Sarah, at 5 feet 6 inches and barely 130 pounds, often struggled with equipment that seemed designed for much larger officers. During her first weeks on the job, Sarah had quickly learned that standard police procedures often had to be modified or completely abandoned when dealing with the extreme conditions of the Alaskan interior. Radio communication was frequently interrupted by atmospheric conditions. Backup could be hours away due to vast distances and impassable roads, and the cold itself became a constant enemy that could disable equipment and endanger lives without warning. The department's jurisdiction covered an area larger than most entire states, with a population density so low that officers routinely patrolled alone for 12-hour shifts without seeing another human being. The isolation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the job for Sarah, who had grown up in a crowded urban environment where help was never more than minutes away. Mike had been patient with Sarah's adjustment period, but she could sense his growing concern about her readiness for independent patrol. Her marksmanship scores, which had been exemplary in the controlled environment of the police academy, had suffered dramatically when she attempted to qualify with cold weather gear. The bulky gloves required for outdoor survival made precise trigger control nearly impossible, and the weight of her winter clothing threw off her shooting stance completely. The thing about policing up here, Mike had explained during one of their training sessions, is that when something goes wrong, it goes really wrong, really fast. There's no calling for backup and waiting 10 minutes for help to arrive. Out here, you might be the only law enforcement officer within 100 miles, and if you can't handle the situation yourself, people die. Sarah understood the gravity of Mike's words, but she wasn't sure she was ready for that level of responsibility. Her self-doubt had only grown stronger after an incident 2 weeks earlier when she and Mike had responded to a domestic violence call at a remote cabin 30 miles outside of Fairbanks. The call had seemed routine until they arrived to find an armed suspect who refused to surrender and had already fired several shots at his estranged wife. In the chaos that followed, Sarah had frozen when Mike ordered her to take a position where she could provide cover fire if necessary. The bulky winter clothing had made it impossible for her to quickly access her weapon, and by the time she had managed to draw her service pistol, Mike had already resolved the situation by tackling the suspect from behind. Nobody was hurt, but Sarah's failure to respond effectively had shaken her confidence badly. Mike had been understanding about the incident, reminding Sarah that most rookie officers needed time to adjust to high-stress situations. But she could see the doubt in his eyes, and she knew that her window for proving herself was rapidly closing. The department couldn't afford to carry an officer who wasn't ready for the unique challenges of Arctic law enforcement, and Sarah was beginning to wonder if she should request a transfer to a warmer climate where her skills might be more applicable. The morning briefing on January 15th was conducted by Sergeant Rodriguez, a stern woman in her 40s who had earned her rank through 15 years of exemplary service in some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. Rodriguez had a reputation for being tough, but fair, and she had made it clear to Sarah that she expected the same level of performance from rookie officers as she did from veterans. "We've got reports of unusual activity in the Chena River Recreation Area," Rodriguez announced to the assembled officers. "Multiple witnesses have reported seeing armed individuals in camouflage clothing setting up what appears to be a camp in the restricted wildlife preserve. Fish and Wildlife has requested our assistance, and given the remote location and potential for armed resistance, we're treating this as a high-priority situation." Sarah felt her stomach tighten as Rodriguez continued the briefing. The Chena River Recreation Area was a vast wilderness preserve located 40 miles northeast of Fairbanks, accessible only by a single dirt road that was frequently impassable during winter months. The area was popular with hunters and outdoor enthusiasts during the summer, but it was officially closed to camping during the winter months due to the extreme danger posed by the weather conditions. "Chun and Kowalski will take the lead on this investigation," Rodriguez announced, looking directly at Sarah. "Given the remote location and potential for extended operations in extreme weather, you'll be equipped with winter survival gear and authorized to carry additional ammunition and emergency supplies." As the briefing concluded, Mike approached Sarah with a serious expression. "This could be your chance to prove yourself," he said quietly. "But I want you to understand that we're heading into a situation where backup will be at least 2 hours away, assuming the road stays passable. If we encounter armed resistance, you're going to have to be ready to act decisively." Sarah nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "I understand, Mike. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Mike replied, but Sarah could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Just remember everything we've practiced, and trust your training. Sometimes the situations that seem most impossible are the ones where good officers prove what they're really made of." As they prepared to leave for the Chena River Recreation Area, Sarah carefully checked her equipment multiple times. Her service weapon was loaded and secured in its holster, and she carried 2 additional magazines of ammunition in her duty belt. For longer-range situations, she had been issued a Remington 700 rifle, a weapon she had trained with extensively but had never fired outside of the controlled environment of the shooting range. The drive to the recreation area took almost 2 hours, with Mike navigating carefully along icy roads that wound through dense forests of spruce and birch trees. As they drove deeper into the wilderness, Sarah felt the isolation settling around them like a heavy blanket. The radio chatter from dispatch grew increasingly faint, and she realized that they were truly on their own until they completed their investigation and returned to civilization. "Tell me about your shooting experience," Mike asked as they drove, his tone casual but probing. "I know you scored well at the academy, but have you ever had to shoot in a real-world situation?" Sarah shook her head. "Only training scenarios and qualification courses. I've never even drawn my weapon during an actual call." Mike nodded thoughtfully. "That's normal for a rookie, but I want you to start thinking about what you'll do if this situation escalates. The rifle you're carrying has an effective range of over 600 yards, and in conditions like this, that might be the difference between success and failure." As they approached the recreation area, Sarah could see smoke rising from somewhere deep in the forest. Mike parked their patrol vehicle at the entrance to the preserve, and They began the process of putting on the additional winter gear that would keep them alive during an extended operation in the extreme cold. The temperature had dropped to minus 42 degrees, cold enough to cause frostbite and exposed skin within minutes. Sarah pulled on her insulated face mask and adjusted her snow goggles, transforming herself into an anonymous figure bundled in layers of protective clothing. The rifle felt awkward and heavy across her back, and she wondered if she would be able to use it effectively if the situation required precision shooting. As they began hiking toward the source of the smoke, Sarah realized that she was about to face the first real test of her abilities as a police officer. Everything she had trained for had led to this moment, and she knew that her response to whatever they encountered in the wilderness would determine whether she had a future in law enforcement or would be forced to find a different career path. The snow crunched under their boots as they made their way deeper into the forest, and Sarah tried to calm her racing heart by focusing on her breathing and the techniques she had learned from managing stress under pressure. She had no way of knowing that within the next few hours, she would be faced with a situation that would test every skill she possessed and force her to make a shot that would be talked about in law enforcement circles for years to come. The hike through the snow-covered forest proved more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. What appeared to be a simple quarter-mile walk to investigate the smoke became a grueling trek through knee-deep snow that had accumulated over several days of continuous snowfall. Each step required significant effort, and Sarah found herself breathing heavily within minutes, her warm breath creating clouds of vapor that immediately froze on her face mask. Mike moved ahead with the confident stride of someone who had spent decades navigating Alaskan wilderness. His military training and years of police work in extreme conditions had given him an almost supernatural ability to read the terrain and weather conditions. He paused frequently to allow Sarah to catch up, using hand signals to communicate rather than speaking aloud, which would have required removing their face protection and risking frostbite. As they moved deeper into the forest, Sarah began to notice signs that they were not alone in the wilderness. Fresh tire tracks were visible in the snow along what appeared to be an old logging road, and she could see boot prints leading toward the source of the smoke. The tracks appeared to have been made by multiple individuals, and the depth of the impressions suggested they were carrying heavy equipment. Mike stopped abruptly and raised his hand in a signal for silence. Through the trees ahead, Sarah could see the flickering orange glow of a campfire, and she could hear the distant sound of voices carried on the frigid air. Mike motioned for her to follow him as he left the main trail and began moving through the dense undergrowth, using the trees for cover as they approached the campsite. From their concealed position about 100 yards from the fire, Sarah could see that the situation was far more serious than a simple case of illegal camping. At least 6 men were visible around a large military-style tent, and she could clearly see that several of them were carrying assault rifles. Scattered around the campsite were wooden crates that appeared to contain ammunition and other supplies, suggesting that this was not a temporary hunting camp, but a more permanent and potentially dangerous operation. Mike carefully removed a pair of binoculars from his pack and spent several minutes observing the campsite, making notes in a waterproof notebook. He then passed the binoculars to Sarah, who was shocked by what she saw when she focused on the men around the fire. The individuals appeared to be wearing military-style camouflage uniforms, and their weapons and equipment were far more sophisticated than anything a normal hunting party would carry. One of the men was clearly in a position of authority, directing the activities of the others and consulting what appeared to be a detailed map. Sarah watched as he pointed toward different areas of the forest, and she realized with growing alarm that they might be witnessing the planning stages of some kind of organized criminal activity. Mike motioned for Sarah to follow him as he moved to a position that would allow them to get closer to the campsite without being detected. The new position was behind a fallen log that provided excellent cover while giving them a clear view of the entire area. From this vantage point, Sarah could see additional equipment that had not been visible from their original position, including what appeared to be communications equipment and additional weapons. The temperature continued to drop as afternoon turned toward evening, and Sarah realized that they faced a serious dilemma. Standard police procedure would require them to withdraw and call for backup before attempting to confront such a heavily armed group. But their radio communication with dispatch had become increasingly unreliable as they moved deeper into the wilderness. Even if they could establish contact, backup would be hours away, and there was no guarantee that additional officers would be able to reach the remote location before dark. Mike seemed to be wrestling with the same concerns as he continued to observe the campsite through his binoculars. Sarah could see the tension in his posture as he weighed their options, and she knew that whatever decision he made would have serious consequences for both of them. The situation became more complicated when one of the men at the campsite began walking in their direction, apparently conducting some kind of perimeter patrol. Mike and Sarah pressed themselves flat against the snow behind the fallen log, hoping that their winter camouflage would help them blend into the landscape. The man passed within 20 feet of their position, close enough that Sarah could see the details of his weapons and equipment. As the patrol returned to the main campsite, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through the trees, she could see the outlines of additional tents and shelters that had not been visible from their original observation point. This was not a small group of armed individuals conducting illegal hunting activities. This appeared to be a significant organized operation with enough personnel and equipment to pose a serious threat to public safety. Mike carefully photographed the campsite using a camera equipped with a telephoto lens, documenting the weapons, equipment, and personnel they could observe. He then began the delicate process of trying to establish radio contact with dispatch, using a variety of frequencies and transmission powers in an attempt to penetrate the atmospheric interference that was blocking their communications. After several attempts, Mike was able to establish brief contact with the police dispatcher in Fairbanks. The signal was weak and filled with static, but he was able to relay their location and provide a basic description of what they had observed. The dispatcher's response was barely audible, but Sarah could make out enough words to understand that backup would be attempted, but that weather conditions were making travel increasingly difficult. As darkness began to fall, the situation took an ominous turn. The men at the campsite began extinguishing their fire and appeared to be preparing to move out. Sarah watched through the binoculars as they loaded equipment into what appeared to be military-style vehicles that had been concealed under camouflage netting. The organized and professional manner of their activities suggested that these were not amateur criminals, but individuals with significant training and experience. Mike made a decision that would prove to be crucial. Rather than maintaining their observation position and risking losing the group entirely, he decided that they needed to follow at a safe distance and attempt to determine where the armed individuals were heading. This decision required them to abandon the relative safety of their concealed position and move through the forest in near total darkness while maintaining visual contact with potentially dangerous criminals. The pursuit through the dark forest was one of the most challenging experiences of Sarah's life. The extreme cold had made the snow crust over, creating a surface that would support a person's weight for a few steps before suddenly giving way and plunging them knee-deep into powder. The noise created by breaking through the snow crust made stealth nearly impossible, and Sarah found herself constantly worried that they would be detected by the group they were following. Mike's military training proved invaluable during the pursuit. He was able to navigate through the forest using terrain features and natural landmarks, maintaining a safe distance from the armed group while ensuring that they didn't lose contact entirely. Sarah struggled to keep up with his pace, but she was determined not to slow down the operation or compromise their safety through inexperience. After more than an hour of difficult travel through the forest, the group they were following stopped at what appeared to be a predetermined rendezvous point. Sarah and Mike took cover behind a cluster of boulders and watched as additional vehicles arrived at the location. The new arrivals included what appeared to be a large truck that could potentially be used to transport significant amounts of illegal materials. From their new observation position, Sarah could see that the operation was much larger and more sophisticated than they had initially realized. The coordination between the different groups suggested extensive planning and organization, and the quality of their equipment indicated access to significant financial resources. This was clearly not a simple case of poaching or illegal camping that could be handled by two officers working alone. The radio in Mike's pack suddenly crackled to life with an urgent transmission from dispatch. Through the static, Sarah could hear that additional law enforcement agencies had been notified about their situation and that a coordinated response was being organized. However, the dispatcher also warned that deteriorating weather conditions were complicating rescue efforts and that they might be on their own for several more hours. As Sarah listened to the radio transmission, she realized that she was facing exactly the kind of situation that Mike had warned her about during her training. They were alone in the wilderness with armed criminals, backup was hours away, and the weather conditions were becoming increasingly dangerous. Everything she had learned during her police academy training and Her first months on the job would be put to the test in the hours ahead. The temperature had dropped to minus 45 degrees, cold enough to cause serious injury or death if they were forced to remain exposed for an extended period. Sarah's hands were beginning to lose feeling despite her insulated gloves, and she knew that her ability to operate her weapons effectively was being compromised by the extreme cold. Mike seemed to sense her growing anxiety and moved closer so that he could communicate without using the radio. "I know this seems overwhelming," he whispered, "but remember that you have trained for situations like this. Trust your instincts, follow your training, and be ready to act if the situation requires it. Sometimes rookie officers are exactly what a situation needs because you haven't learned to overthink things yet." Sarah nodded, trying to draw confidence from Mike's words. She checked her weapons and equipment one more time, ensuring that everything was accessible despite the bulky winter clothing. The rifle across her back felt reassuring, even though she had never imagined that she might need to use it in a real-world situation so early in her career. As they settled in for what could be a long night of surveillance in life-threatening conditions, Sarah had no way of knowing that the skills she had learned on the shooting range were about to be tested in ways that would define the rest of her career in law enforcement. The situation deteriorated rapidly as midnight approached. What had begun as a routine investigation of illegal camping had evolved into something far more dangerous, and Sarah found herself in the middle of what appeared to be a major criminal operation with implications that extended far beyond simple trespassing violations. Through their continued surveillance, Mike and Sarah had pieced together a disturbing picture of the group's activities. The armed individuals were clearly engaged in some form of smuggling operation, using the remote wilderness location as a staging area for moving illegal materials through the Canadian border region. The sophisticated equipment and military-style organization suggested connections to organized crime or possibly even international terrorism. Mike had managed to establish intermittent radio contact with federal law enforcement agencies, and the response had been immediate and intense. FBI, DEA, and Border Patrol agents were reportedly en route to the area, but weather conditions continued to delay their arrival. A major winter storm was moving through the region, bringing with it the potential for whiteout conditions that could trap everyone in the wilderness for days. The criminal group seemed to be aware that time was running short. Sarah watched through binoculars as they accelerated their activities, loading equipment and supplies with an urgency that suggested they planned to complete their operation and disappear before law enforcement could respond in force. The window for intercepting them was rapidly closing, and Mike faced an impossible decision about whether to maintain their surveillance position or attempt to intervene with only 2 officers. The decision was made for them when one of the criminals discovered their observation post. Sarah saw the man approaching their position seconds before he spotted them, and she watched in horror as he raised his rifle and shouted a warning to his companions. Mike reacted instantly, tackling Sarah and rolling both of them behind the boulder cluster just as the first shots rang out across the frozen landscape. The gunfire was deafeningly loud in the still night air, and Sarah could hear bullets striking the rocks around their position. Mike drew his service weapon and returned fire, but their position was exposed and defensible for only a short time. The criminals had the advantage of numbers and superior firepower, and Sarah realized with growing terror that they were trapped in a firefight they could not win through conventional tactics. "We need to move," Mike shouted over the sound of gunfire. "They're going to try to flank us, and we can't defend this position against that many people." Sarah understood the tactical situation even through her fear and adrenaline. Their current position provided cover from direct fire, but it would be useless if the criminals were able to move around to their sides or behind them. They needed to reach a more defensible location, but any movement would expose them to enemy fire across open ground covered with snow that would make rapid movement nearly impossible. Mike made the decision to attempt a tactical withdrawal to a position deeper in the forest where the trees would provide better concealment. "I'll provide covering fire," he told Sarah. "When I say move, you run toward that cluster of trees, and don't stop until you reach cover. Once you're in position, you provide cover for me to follow." Sarah's police academy training took over as Mike began laying down suppressing fire. She sprinted across the open ground as fast as her heavy winter clothing would allow, expecting at any moment to feel the impact of bullets. She reached the tree line just as Mike's magazine ran empty, and she immediately took up a position where she could return fire while he reloaded. From her new position, Sarah had a clear view of the criminal campsite and could see that the situation was even worse than they had realized. At least 8 armed individuals were now actively engaged in the firefight, and they were using military tactics to advance on the officers' positions. These were clearly not amateur criminals, but professional operators with extensive training and experience. Mike reached the tree line and immediately began assessing their tactical options. Their radio was still receiving intermittent signals from dispatch, and he was able to relay their situation to the incoming federal agents. However, the closest backup was still over an hour away, and the criminals were obviously planning to eliminate the threat posed by the 2 officers before completing their operation and disappearing. "Sarah," Mike called out during a brief lull in the gunfire, "I need you to take the rifle and find a position where you can provide long-range support. These guys are going to try to overrun our position, and we need to keep them at a distance until backup arrives." Sarah's hands were shaking as she unslung the Remington 700 rifle from her back. She had trained extensively with the weapon, but all of her experience had been on controlled shooting ranges under ideal conditions. The extreme cold was making her fingers numb despite her insulated gloves, and the bulky winter clothing made it difficult to achieve a proper shooting position. Mike pointed toward a small rise about 50 yards away that would provide an elevated shooting position with clear fields of fire toward the criminal campsite. "You need to get to that position and set up for precision shots. I'll stay here and try to keep them occupied with small arms fire. Remember everything you learned about cold weather shooting, and trust your training." The move to the elevated position required Sarah to cross another stretch of open ground under potential enemy observation. She waited for Mike to begin another round of covering fire, then sprinted toward the rise while staying as low as possible. The snow was deeper than expected, and she found herself struggling through drifts that came up to her waist in some areas. She reached the elevated position just as the criminals began another coordinated advance. From her new vantage point, Sarah could see the entire battlefield laid out below her, and she realized with stark clarity that she and Mike were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The only advantage they possessed was her ability to engage targets at longer range than the criminals' assault rifles were optimized for. Sarah quickly set up a shooting position using a fallen log as a rest for the rifle. The cold had made the metal components of the weapon nearly painful to touch, even through her insulated gloves, and she had to work carefully to ensure that her equipment would function properly in the extreme conditions. Her breath was creating clouds of vapor that threatened to obscure her vision through the rifle scope, forcing her to time her shots during brief breaks in her breathing. The first target presented itself as one of the criminals moved into the open while attempting to flank Mike's position. Sarah centered the crosshairs on the man's center mass and began the slow, steady trigger pull that she had practiced hundreds of times during training. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the frozen landscape, and she watched through the scope as the target went down immediately. The effect of her shot on the criminal operation was immediate and dramatic. The coordinated advance stopped as the remaining criminals sought cover and tried to locate the source of the long-range fire. Sarah could hear shouting from the campsite as they attempted to reorganize their tactics to deal with the sniper threat she now represented. Mike's voice came over the radio with a mixture of relief and admiration. "Outstanding shot, Sarah. You just bought us some time. Keep them pinned down while I try to get a better position." Sarah felt a surge of confidence as she realized that her training was proving effective even under the extreme conditions. She began systematically engaging targets as they appeared, using the superior range and accuracy of her rifle to keep the criminals from advancing while Mike maneuvered to a more advantageous position. The battle continued for almost 30 minutes, with Sarah providing precision fire support while Mike engaged targets at closer range. The criminals were clearly becoming frustrated by their inability to advance against the 2-officer team, and Sarah could see through her scope that they were beginning to show signs of panic and disorganization. However, the extreme cold was taking its toll on both officers. Sarah's hands were becoming increasingly numb, making precise shooting more difficult, and she knew that her effectiveness would continue to decline as her core body temperature dropped. Mike was also showing signs of cold-related stress, and she realized that they were in a race against time to maintain their defensive capability until backup arrived. The situation took another dramatic turn when Sarah observed movement in an area that had previously appeared empty. Through her rifle scope, she could see additional armed individuals moving through the forest in what appeared to be an attempt to completely surround the officer's position. If successful, this flanking maneuver would eliminate any possibility of escape, and could result in the officers being overwhelmed by superior numbers. Sarah quickly repositioned her rifle and began engaging the flanking force, but she realized that she was running low on ammunition. Each shot had to count, and she could not afford to waste rounds on targets that were not clearly threatening her and Mike's survival. The pressure of making life-or-death decisions with limited resources was unlike anything she had experienced during her training. Mike seemed to sense the deteriorating situation and made a decision that would prove crucial to their survival. Rather than continuing to defend their current positions, he decided to attempt a tactical offensive that would disrupt the criminals' plans and potentially give them the advantage they needed to survive until backup arrived. "Sarah," his voice came over the radio with urgent intensity. "I need you to provide covering fire for a direct assault on their main position. I'm going to try to get close enough to use grenades and force them to scatter. This is our only chance to break up their coordination before they overwhelm us." Sarah understood the desperation behind Mike's plan, but she also knew that its success would depend entirely on her ability to provide accurate long-range fire support that would prevent the criminals from targeting Mike during his assault. Everything she had learned about precision shooting under pressure was about to be tested in the most demanding situation imaginable, and the lives of both officers depended on her performance with a rifle she had qualified with only weeks earlier. As Mike began his assault, Sarah realized that the next few minutes would determine whether she would prove herself as a competent officer or whether both she and her training officer would become casualties in a remote Alaskan wilderness that few people would ever know existed. The moment of truth arrived with startling suddenness. Mike's assault on the criminal position had initially succeeded in creating confusion and disrupting their coordinated defense, but as Sarah watched through her rifle scope, she realized that the situation was about to turn catastrophic. The criminals had recovered from their initial surprise faster than expected, and Mike was now pinned down in an exposed position with nowhere to retreat. Through her scope, Sarah could see that Mike had taken cover behind an overturned sled about 60 yards from the main criminal encampment. His position provided minimal protection, and she could see muzzle flashes from multiple weapons as the criminals concentrated their fire on his location. Bullets were striking the sled and the snow around it with increasing frequency, and Sarah knew that it was only a matter of time before Mike's inadequate cover would be penetrated. The temperature had dropped to -48 degrees, creating conditions that were affecting everyone on the battlefield. Sarah's rifle scope was beginning to fog despite the anti-condensation coating, and she had to work constantly to maintain clear vision. Her hands were so cold that she could barely feel the trigger, forcing her to rely entirely on muscle memory and training to operate her weapon effectively. Mike's voice came over the radio with barely controlled desperation. "Sarah, I need immediate suppressing fire on the position directly in front of me. They're about to rush my position, and I don't have enough ammunition to hold them off. You're the only thing standing between me and a very bad situation." Sarah quickly identified the threat that Mike was describing. 3 criminals were preparing to advance across open ground toward his position, using a coordinated movement technique that would make them difficult targets for his pistol. From her elevated position, however, she had a clear shot at all 3 individuals, and she realized that this might be her only opportunity to prevent Mike from being overrun. The first shot was the most important. Sarah centered her crosshairs on the lead criminal and controlled her breathing carefully, timing her shot for the brief moment between heartbeats when her rifle would be most stable. The extreme cold had made the rifle's action sluggish, and she had to work the bolt more forcefully than usual to chamber the next round. Her shot struck the lead criminal center mass, dropping him immediately and causing the other 2 to dive for cover. The psychological effect of accurate long-range fire was evident as the remaining criminals abandoned their assault and sought defensive positions. Sarah had bought Mike precious time, but she knew that the reprieve would be temporary. Mike used the break in enemy fire to reposition himself to a more defensible location behind a cluster of boulders. From his new position, he was able to provide more effective return fire, but Sarah could see that he was running low on ammunition and would soon be unable to maintain his defensive capability. The criminal organization was clearly more sophisticated than either officer had initially realized. Through her scope, Sarah observed that they were using hand signals to coordinate their movements, and their tactical proficiency suggested military or paramilitary training. They had quickly adapted to the threat posed by her long-range fire and were now using cover and concealment more effectively. A new threat emerged as Sarah detected movement in the forest to her left. Two criminals had broken away from the main group and were attempting to flank her position, using the dense tree cover to approach within assault rifle range. If they succeeded in reaching a position where they could engage her effectively, both she and Mike would lose their primary advantage in the firefight. Sarah made a rapid decision to abandon her current shooting position and move to a location that would allow her to engage the flanking threat while maintaining support for Mike. The movement required her to cross open ground while carrying the heavy rifle and ammunition, all while wearing bulky winter clothing that severely limited her mobility. She reached her new position just as the flanking criminals emerged from the tree line. The first target was clearly visible at a range of approximately 120 yards, presenting a challenging but manageable shot under normal conditions. However, the extreme cold and Sarah's physical stress from the extended firefight made the shot far more difficult than anything she had attempted during training. Sarah's hands were shaking from both cold and adrenaline as she established her shooting position behind a fallen tree. The rifle scope was now heavily fogged, forcing her to rely primarily on the weapon's iron sights for target acquisition. Her breathing was rapid and irregular from the physical exertion of moving through the snow, making it difficult to achieve the steady respiratory rhythm necessary for precision shooting. The criminal she was targeting had taken cover behind a tree, but was exposing enough of his torso to provide a viable target. Sarah knew that she would have only one opportunity for the shot before he would realize her new position and take more effective cover. The range was at the limit of her confidence with iron sights under ideal conditions, and the current circumstances were far from ideal. She forced herself to slow her breathing and focus entirely on the fundamentals of marksmanship that had been drilled into her during countless hours of training. The front sight became her entire world as she aligned it carefully with the target and began the slow, steady trigger pull that would determine the outcome of the shot. The rifle fired just as the criminal began to move to a new position. Sarah watched as her bullet struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his weapon. The shot was not immediately fatal, but it effectively removed him from the firefight and sent a clear message to his companion about the deadly accuracy of the police sniper. Mike's voice came over the radio with obvious relief. "Excellent shooting, Sarah. You just saved both our lives. The flankers are neutralized, and I can see backup vehicles approaching from the access road. We just need to hold our positions for another 10 minutes. Sarah felt a surge of exhaustion as the adrenaline of combat began to wear off. Her entire body was shaking from the combination of extreme cold and stress, and she realized that she had fired almost all of her rifle ammunition during the engagement. If the firefight continued much longer, she would be reduced to her service pistol, which would be nearly useless at the ranges they were dealing with. The arrival of backup was signaled by the distant sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the frigid air. Sarah looked up to see a state police helicopter approaching the area, equipped with searchlights that turned night into day across the battlefield. The psychological effect on the remaining criminals was immediate, as they realized that their window for escape was rapidly closing. Federal agents began arriving by road and aircraft within minutes, transforming the isolated wilderness firefight into a major law enforcement operation. The criminals, faced with overwhelming odds, began surrendering individually as they realized that continued resistance was futile. As the situation stabilized, Sarah was approached by an FBI agent who identified himself as Agent Martinez. "Officer Chun, I've been monitoring your radio traffic for the past hour, and I have to say that your performance tonight has been absolutely exceptional. You and Detective Kowalski maintained tactical control over a superior force under some of the most challenging conditions imaginable." Sarah was too exhausted and cold to fully process the compliment, but she felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she realized that she had not only survived her first major firefight, but had performed effectively under circumstances that would have challenged even veteran officers. The self-doubt that had plagued her during her first months on the job was replaced by a quiet confidence in her abilities and training. Mike approached as the crime scene was being secured by federal agents. His expression showed a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and genuine admiration. "Sarah, what you did tonight went far beyond what anyone could expect from a rookie officer. Those shots you made at extended range in these conditions would have been challenging for our best marksmen. You didn't just prove yourself tonight. You saved both our lives and broke up what appears to be a major smuggling operation." As Sarah began the process of providing statements to federal investigators and completing the paperwork that would document one of the most significant law enforcement operations in the region's recent history. She reflected on how much her life had changed in the space of a few hours. The scared rookie who had started the shift wondering if she was cut out for police work had been replaced by a confident officer who had proven her capabilities under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The extreme cold had taken its toll on everyone involved in the operation, and Sarah was grateful when she was finally able to return to the heated police vehicle. Her hands were so numb that she could barely operate the door handle, and she realized that she had been operating at the very edge of human endurance for several hours. Agent Martinez approached the vehicle as Sarah was warming up. "Officer Chin, I wanted to personally thank you for your actions tonight. The intelligence we've gathered from this operation is going to help us break up a major international smuggling ring that has been operating through this region for months. Without your marksmanship skills and tactical awareness, we might never have been able to apprehend these individuals." As they drove back toward Fairbanks through the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah realized that she had found her calling in the challenging world of Arctic law enforcement. The skills and instincts that had seemed inadequate during her training period had proven themselves under the ultimate test, and she now understood that she possessed the rare combination of technical ability and mental toughness required for police work in one of the world's most demanding environments. The aftermath of the Chena River operation would prove to be as transformative for Sarah Chin's career as the firefight itself. Within hours of returning to the Fairbanks police station, word of her performance had spread throughout the Alaska law enforcement community and beyond. The rookie officer who had questioned her own abilities just days earlier found herself at the center of a story that would be retold in police academies and training centers across the country. The official debriefing was conducted by a joint task force that included representatives from the FBI, DEA, Border Patrol, and Alaska State Police. Sarah sat in the conference room feeling somewhat overwhelmed as senior law enforcement officials from multiple agencies questioned her about every detail of the operation. Her shooting performance, in particular, drew intense scrutiny from firearms instructors and tactical specialists who were amazed by her accuracy under such extreme conditions. Agent Martinez presented the preliminary findings of the federal investigation during the debriefing. The criminal organization that Sarah and Mike had stumbled upon was part of an international smuggling network that had been moving drugs, weapons, and contraband through the Canadian border region for more than 2 years. The sophisticated equipment and military-style training observed during the firefight were consistent with a professional operation that had successfully evaded law enforcement until that night. Officer Chin's marksmanship was absolutely crucial to breaking up this operation, Agent Martinez explained to the assembled officials. Her ability to provide effective long-range fire support allowed Detective Kowalski to maintain tactical pressure on the criminals until backup arrived. Without that capability, we would have lost both officers, and the criminals would have escaped with evidence that took us months to develop. The ballistics analysis of Sarah's shooting was particularly impressive to the firearms experts in attendance. She had fired a total of 11 rounds from her rifle during the engagement, scoring hits on 7 different targets at ranges varying from 60 to over 200 yards. The accuracy was remarkable under any circumstances, but the extreme weather conditions and high-stress environment made her performance almost unprecedented for an officer with her limited experience. Detective Mike Kowalski provided his own assessment of Sarah's performance during the debriefing. "I've been a police officer for 20 years and served 2 combat tours in Afghanistan," he told the group. "I've worked with some exceptional marksmen, but what Officer Chun accomplished last night was extraordinary. She adapted to changing tactical situations, made life-or-death decisions under pressure, and executed precision shots that kept us alive until backup could arrive." The physical evidence collected from the crime scene supported the officers' accounts of the firefight and provided federal investigators with crucial intelligence about the smuggling network's operations. Maps and documents recovered from the campsite revealed planned routes through multiple wilderness areas, suggesting that the organization had been using Alaska's vast wilderness as a corridor for moving illegal materials between Canada and the lower 48 states. Sarah's rifle was subjected to detailed analysis by the FBI's firearms unit, partly to verify her account of the shooting, but also to determine whether the weapon's performance under extreme conditions had contributed to her accuracy. The results showed that the rifle had functioned flawlessly despite the brutal cold, and that Sarah's shooting accuracy was entirely attributable to her skill and training rather than any equipment advantages. The story of the Chena River operation began appearing in law enforcement publications within weeks, with particular emphasis on Sarah's transformation from uncertain rookie to combat-tested officer. The narrative became a case study in police academies across the country, demonstrating how proper training and mental preparation could enable even inexperienced officers to perform effectively under extreme circumstances. Sarah found herself somewhat uncomfortable with the attention and publicity surrounding her actions. During interviews with law enforcement journalists and training specialists, she consistently emphasized the importance of her training officers' guidance and the role that luck and circumstances had played in the operation's success. However, experienced officers who reviewed the tactical details of the firefight recognized that Sarah's performance had gone well beyond simple luck or coincidence. The Alaska Police Association awarded Sarah their Medal of Valor, the highest honor available to Alaska law enforcement officers. The citation specifically mentioned her exceptional courage and marksmanship under life-threatening conditions that resulted in the successful conclusion of a major federal investigation. The award ceremony was attended by law enforcement officials from throughout Alaska and several federal agencies, cementing Sarah's reputation within the professional community. More importantly for Sarah's personal development, the Chena River operation had permanently resolved her doubts about her suitability for police work in Alaska. The confidence she gained from proving herself under the ultimate test translated into improved performance in all aspects of her job. Her subsequent training scores improved dramatically, and she began taking on additional responsibilities that had previously seemed beyond her capabilities. Detective Kowalski requested that Sarah be assigned as his permanent partner, a designation that carried significant prestige within the department. Their working relationship had been forged under fire, and Mike's confidence in Sarah's abilities became one of the strongest endorsements a rookie officer could receive. The partnership would prove to be one of the most effective investigative teams in the department's history. The federal investigation that grew out of the Chena River operation eventually resulted in the arrest of more than 30 individuals across multiple states and provinces. The intelligence gathered from the documents and equipment seized during the firefight led investigators to other smuggling routes and criminal enterprises that had been operating undetected for years. Sarah's actions during that single night had contributed to dismantling a criminal network that had been responsible for moving millions of dollars worth of illegal materials. Sarah's shooting skills became legendary within the Alaska law enforcement community, leading to requests for her to assist with training programs and specialized operations. She was eventually assigned to the department's tactical team and became the primary sniper for high-risk operations throughout northern Alaska. Her experience at Chena River had proven that she possessed not just technical shooting ability but the mental toughness required to perform under pressure. The story took on additional significance when it was featured in a national law enforcement magazine with the headline, "The Arctic Ghost Shot That Changed Everything." The article described how a rookie officer's precision marksmanship had turned the tide in a wilderness firefight that could have resulted in tragedy. The Arctic Ghost nickname stuck, and Sarah found herself recognized by officers from other departments who had heard about her legendary shooting performance. Years later, Sarah would look back on the Chena River operation as the defining moment of her career, but not necessarily for the reasons that others might expect. While the shooting accuracy and tactical performance were important, the real transformation had been psychological. The self-doubt and uncertainty that had plagued her during her first months on the job had been permanently replaced by a quiet confidence that would serve her throughout her career. The operation also reinforced for Sarah the importance of thorough training and preparation. Every hour she had spent on the shooting range, every scenario she had practiced at the police academy, and every piece of advice she had received from her training officer had contributed to her performance when it mattered most. The experience became a powerful reminder that there are no shortcuts to developing the skills and mindset required for effective police work. Sarah continued serving with the Fairbanks Police Department for another 15 years, eventually rising to the rank of detective sergeant and becoming one of the most respected officers in Alaska. She never forgot the lessons learned during her first major operation, and she made a point of passing those lessons on to the rookie officers who came under her supervision. The Chena River operation became part of Alaska law enforcement folklore, retold whenever experienced officers wanted to illustrate the importance of training, preparation, and mental toughness. For Sarah Chun, it represented the night when she discovered that she possessed capabilities she had never known existed, and when a scared rookie transformed into the kind of officer that others would aspire to become. The extreme conditions that had once seemed like insurmountable obstacles became simply another aspect of the job that required proper preparation and technique. Sarah had learned that even the most challenging circumstances could be overcome through training, determination, and the willingness to trust in abilities that might not become apparent until they are tested under pressure. In the end, the story of the Arctic Ghost Shot was not just about marksmanship or tactical proficiency. It was about the moment when a young officer discovered that she possessed the rare combination of skills and character traits that define truly exceptional law enforcement professionals. The frozen wilderness of Alaska had provided the ultimate testing ground, and Sarah Chun had emerged from that test as a legend in her own right.